Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are on the globe. I'm Barry Smitherman, and I am the chairman and president of the newly created Texas Geothermal Energy Alliance, or TxGEA for short. I'm also the former chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Texas and the Texas Railroad Commission, which has nothing to do with railroads, but regulates the Texas oil, gas, and coal industries. And with me this morning is Brad Jones. Brad is the interim CEO and president of ERCOT. He is also the former CEO of the New York ISO. And he was at ERCOT previously as the chief operating officer, and as well was at Luminant, one of Texas's preeminent and largest independent power generators. We're both thrilled to be here with you today at Pivot 2022. So far, it's been an exciting week, and we have heard from geothermal experts and fascinating speakers and panels from across the globe talking about geothermal energy. Today, Brad and I will discuss the Texas grid, also known as ERCOT, and the potential for geothermal energy to play a role in the Texas electricity market. Hey, Brad, welcome to Pivot 2022.
Thank you, Barry. Pleased to be here.
Good to see you. Now, Brad, I have a question for you, and I just want you to put a pin in this and not answer it immediately. We're going to come back to it later in our discussion. How would you feel about a new energy resource that is reliable, dependable, not subject to the weather, and dispatchable? I want you to think about, I see you smiling. I want you to think about that for
That sounds perfect, Barry. I'll take all I can get.
I thought you might say that. And we're going to tease this out a little bit later in our discussion. But for now, there may be some people, Brad, on today at Pivot 2022 who are not familiar with the ERCOT market. So would you just give us a little primer about ERCOT?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. So ERCOT, just in its basic sense, operates the transmission grid for the state of Texas, but also operates markets for people to buy and sell electricity. So the best way that we've usually analogized it is that the one half of the business is like an air traffic controller. We're making sure that generators, which we don't own, are able to move power across transmission lines that we don't own to customers that we don't service. But we coordinate all that process in between, just like with an air traffic controller would make sure that airplanes are getting to the right airports, they have their landing schedules, they are brought in safely, and then they can take their passengers to the next location. It's the exact same type structure. So we're in the middle of making sure that the power moves throughout the system appropriately. We also plan the transmission system several years in the future to make sure that we can accommodate that growth. And then finally, on the other side, we run the markets for the electric industry in Texas, just like the New York Stock Exchange would in New York. The stock exchange does not take its own positions in the market. It just operates the market. It sets up the structure for how people buy and sell and how they trade. Those are the two major functions of ERCOT in Texas.
Yeah, just to summarize a bit, you don't own any generation.
That is correct. We don't own transmission. We do not own or service the customers at the other end.
You're the traffic cop, or your analogy, the air traffic controller, making sure that the power gets to where it needs to be. And you do some planning, some advanced planning to give market participants an indication of how much power you think is going to be present on the grid in the future. And then, of course, if you begin to run short, you have very limited tools to keep the system balanced. Maybe you could touch on that briefly.
Well, actually, we have quite a few tools as we get into short condition, but we must be able to make sure that we're attracting the right type of generation for long-term resource adequacy. The real concern for us today is, although we love wind and we love our solar resources, they're coming in at a great time and providing a lot of value to us. We know that there's those days that are both dark and still, and we have to prepare for those as well. And the economics mean that we have to find ways to attract the right types of generation. Everything you described earlier, dispatchable, it comes in at a reasonable cost. is available to us in the system. All of those things that you described earlier as a good resource becomes the types of resources we need to develop for the future to balance those renewable resources. We don't have hydro like a lot of areas. So, up in New York and New England, they have hydro capabilities so they can balance some of the resources with that. California has the same. We don't have hydro coming out of Oklahoma. Just not a lot of water and not a lot of elevation change between the two states to rely upon hydro from Oklahoma to serve our needs in Texas. So we have to have other types of resources. And as you talked about earlier, geothermal would be a great resource that is clean, available, and dispatchable.
And just to complete our table setting, Brad, most people know this, but ERCOT is minimally interconnected with the rest of America.
We are. We do have about 820 megawatts of DC interconnections with the rest of the eastern grid. There's also a 1,500 megawatt DC tie line that is proposed with the east, and there's another, I think it's 2,000 megawatt tie proposed with the west. So there are various actions in place to improve our transmission capability, connections with the rest of the country, but there's still some ways off. But I would say that 820 that we currently have and roughly 400 down into Mexico is more than the state of Florida has with the east. They have about 800 megawatts of transfer capability into Florida.
Well, we'll hold the debate about whether ERCOT should be part of the rest of America for another day. As I've said in the past, it's sort of appropriate for a state that was once an independent country to have its own electric grid. One other thing, Brad, give us some sense of how the fuel mix in ERCOT has evolved over the last 20 years.
My goodness, even in the last 10 years, it's changed dramatically. So in the last 10 years, I've got some numbers here. We got 44% gas in terms of capacity today. The next highest capacity resource is wind. It's no longer coal, it's no longer nuclear, it's wind generation. So the wind generation is about 29% of our capacity. Coal is about 12%. Solar is 9%, and nuclear is 4% of the overall capacity. And then the rest, of course, is just batteries and a few things. So you can see that dramatically we've made that shift from coal and nuclear to wind, and solar is coming up very fast. So in our state, we currently have about 36,000 megawatts of wind. That puts us number 5 as a separate country, number 5 overall in the world if we were counted as a separate country. It also puts us at number 1 in the US with the highest amount of wind generation, and we have more wind generation than states number 2 and number 3 combined. So we have that much wind generation. So combined between wind and solar from the period of January through May of this year, 36% of our energy was provided by renewables. That's an incredible number for a state that has such a high demand of load that we do in this state. It's a phenomenal. Our solar is coming up quickly. We have roughly about 12,000 megawatts of solar today. We expect that to expand in the next couple of years dramatically. 20, 25,000 megawatts is not outside of reach. We've got about 60,000 megawatts of solar in our queue just for interconnections. But we believe in a couple of years, we could be close to 2025. So it's amazing resurgence here.
It is. ERCOT's about 2 decades old now. And back in 2002, wind was a rounding error. There was actually no wind on the grid. I remember visiting a wind farm up in the Panhandle, and they couldn't get interconnected and they were frustrated. But now we had, I think last year, you got about 24% of the energy, not the installed capacity from wind. And I know on certain days, wind can be over 50%. Let me ask you if you agree with this characterization of the evolution of the ERCOT market. For the first 10 years or so, it was all about cheap. We were focused in making sure electricity prices were low, and they were low. Restructuring brought to us low electricity prices, and then we embarked upon the CREZ transmission plan, which empowered wind to grow to where it is. So I'd say the second phase of ERCOT was about clean. Can we clean up our system? But now it seems as if we have pivoted. You like the way I use that? We've pivoted to reliable. And much of it stems from Winter Storm Uri in that event. So would you spend a couple of minutes just sort of reviewing what happened that week in February of 2021?
Yeah, and I'd love to, but 2 minutes is nowhere justice I can do for it.
Yeah.
So I'll do what I can, but let me reiterate what you just said. We've always used an acronym in Texas. It is probably used in many other places as well, which is clean, affordable, reliable electricity, CARE. And that acronym is appropriate because all those elements are very important to our people. They want clean energy, they want affordable energy, and they want it reliable. But I think we allowed the pendulum to swing too much to the clean side, not the clean side, to the affordable side. Because for 20 years at ERCOT, I think what we struggled with was every time we came up with a small reliability decision, the answer was, well, that costs some money. Let's not do that. Let's not do that right now. Now we pivoted toward, and I'm using the same word, we pivoted over toward putting reliability up front in that acronym. Putting reliability up front so that we make sure that we can keep the lights on for all Texans. That's most important. Also keeping the focus on affordability and clean energy, but making sure reliability is very much a part of this conversation. So what happened in the Winter Storm Uri? What happened was it was cold. It was colder than we'd ever seen in Texas, colder than my grandfather had seen, colder than my great-grandfather had seen in his lifetime. 130 years ago was the last cold weather event that matched what happened in 2021. And we lost many generators for freezing off, for some for fuel, some for wind turbines that had freezing rain on them, some for coal facilities that their coal piles had frozen up, some for gas facilities that simply could not operate because something had broken or frozen off. Every type of, even a nuclear plant, every type of our generation had some failing that day. And to give you a scale of it, remember, we don't own generation, but 50,000 megawatts of generation was lost during that winter storm. Turned off, was unavailable, was forced outaged because of some problem. 50,000 megawatts. Now, let me put that in context. The peak load in California on their highest day is 48,000 megawatts. We lost more generation the entire state of California uses on their hottest day. That generation put us at a significant deficit. And our role at ERCOT is to make sure we keep load and generation in balance. And so we used all the tools that we had to keep load in balance with generation. Ultimately, when we ran out, we turned to our Alamo. Our Alamo is to ask for customers to be shed, involuntarily shed, by the local distribution companies. They did that at our request. Many of those customers stayed off for many hours, some for more than a day. And it was simply a matter of how quickly we can get that generation back. So the main solution, Barry, is what came out of the legislature and came from the governor, is to change the way we weatherize our fleet. We've done that. Now we, ERCOT, are given the ability to go out and inspect our units to make sure they're weatherized for a 2021 type storm. And if they fail to do so, we have the ability to recommend penalties that go through the PUC of up to $1 million per day.
Yeah, it was a brutal. We had 8 inches of snow at my farm out here west of Austin. I could walk across the lake. I haven't never seen that kind of weather in my lifetime. Now, you and I have been supporters of wind. When I was on the PUC, we embarked on the CREZ transmission plant. But I think we would both admit, and you've said this, I take all the wind I can get, but I would love some more reliable, dispatchable power. And I know a couple of times during that critical week, the wind was not blowing as we would like for it to. Let me fast forward to the summer. It has been a brutal summer. I mean, you've gotten the 1-2 punch of Uri, 5-degree weather out here at my place, and now we've had 105-degree weather out here in my place. Several times this summer, ERCOT has hit a new peak. I think at one point you touched over 80 gigs, and you had to call for conservation a couple of times. So just kind of briefly tell us what's going on. What is it that requires you sometimes to ask Texans to use a little less electricity?
Well, thank you. Great question, Barry. So we have been we've been changing the way that we manage the system. We've been pulling up a lot of the tools that we used to preserve for only when we got into emergency conditions. Only when we were already in a problem area would we use those tools. One of those tools that I want to make sure that we pulled out of that zone was conservation. Conservation should never be a bad word. Conservation helps all of us to control our bills, right? We manage our bills by using a little bit less, by turning off our lights, by turning up the air conditioner. And so when we see something coming in the future, when we see a few days out that our grid is getting tighter than we would like to operate at, we will ask Texas customers for conservation. Now it's new because, as I said, it used to only happen when we got into emergency. But rather than getting ourselves into a problem and trying to dig ourselves out, my philosophy is we prevent ourselves from ever getting into a problem by calling on customers and utilizing the goodwill of all customers to help us out. And I have to tell you, the response was phenomenal. We called for conservation. And normally we call it at the same time at 3 o'clock every day. But wind was really low early on both Monday and Wednesday of the 11th and 13th of July. And so both days we needed to have conservation earlier in the day than we called before. But just by coincidence, we had never done that in a way where it was separated from the other tools that we have that usually start at 3 o'clock. So we were able to see with distinction how customers responded. And on that Monday, we got 500 megawatts of response from conservation. And I got calls from people across the state that I'd given my phone number out to folks when I was on a listening tour across the state. I got calls from people across the state, Barry, and Estelle called me up and she said, I just want you to know that I turned my air conditioner up 2 degrees. And I said, right on, Miss Estelle, keep it up. And June called me and June said, my manager walked up and down the hall right at 2 o'clock, turning off all the extra lights. Just little things like that are amazing to hear. And all of that adds up to the 500 megawatts that we saw on that Monday of just Texans responding to help each other. That's the Texas spirit that I love.
Which is awesome. I mean, we have a great history of rallying to a cause. We've done it for over 150 years. Though I suspect you would have loved to have had 500 megawatts of dispatchable, reliable in your back pocket. Like
I need more than that. I need a lot more than that.
That you could have called upon. One last thing before I want to turn to the future, Brad. You've used the term Dunkelflaute, and I had not heard that before you used it. And one of the panelists just before we came on used that term as well. So it's now becoming a verb as well as a noun, I think. Just describe that for a moment.
So Dunkelflaute, the Germans, it's a German word, of course. It just means dark and still, meaning there's no wind and it's dark. And at those times, the solar and wind renewables can't provide for the grid. The contribution for solar is zero. Contribution for wind can be quite low. So with that combination, we have to have enough other generation to meet all of the demands of our system. We can't simply just begin turning off people's lights and their heat or whatever. And we know in winter, dark and still happens quite often, right? Dark is usually when our peak load is hitting. So solar is not a big contributor to our winter capacity. Wind can be, but oftentimes wind is short. Now the Germans came up with the word because they were the first to really have to work their way through the problem. We are today working our way through the problem in Texas, but we have to address it. And that's why we need other resources. And as you've talked about, geothermal fits perfectly into the space of clean, affordable, reliable, dispatchable electricity.
And let's now turn to the future. We've talked about the past and the future. I'm one of those electric geeks, Brad, that looks at your resource adequacy projections, your SARA report. And in the latest one, there seems to be a lot of wind and solar in the interconnection queue, but maybe only one thermal plant. So as you think about that and the objective to keep the system reliable, again, understanding that we're supportive of renewables, They keep prices low when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. And in fact, we've had a lot of sun this summer, which has made a difference. But that's got to make you a little bit nervous to see intermittent resources being almost all of the future resource in the interconnection queue.
Barry, we have got to find a way to both attract and retain dispatchable generation. Because we know that as we see more solar and wind coming into the fleet, they're going to be very low cost. They will come into our fleet and they will begin to displace other dispatchable generation. As this happens, we have to find ways to make sure that the economics are appropriate for that dispatchable generation to stay in our fleet, because we'll need them for that Dunkelflaute day, right? How'd I use that? That was an adjective that time. so we'll need them for a Dunkelflaute day. So finding that way is part of what the Public Utility Commission of Texas is working on now. I know you were there, so you know how the process works. They've been given the authority by the legislature to look at these issues of how they both attract and retain dispatchable generation. And when I say those two words, it's very important that they stay together, because it's not just about attracting new generation to meet our load growth, but it's also about retaining existing generation appropriately that we need to meet the load that we have today. So it's that combination of both that we need to seek. And the commission is currently looking at that. And I believe they'll have some answers for it later this fall.
Well, we may be able to have the cavalry coming in from the geothermal industry. Let me just share a couple of things with you that are going on. One, the Mitchell Foundation and UT and a number of institutions, including your alma mater, Texas Tech, are working on a big interdisciplinary study to identify the abundance of geothermal resources in Texas. Where are they? How cheaply can we get to them? And when could they be close to grid parity in price? So look for that in October. It'll be sort of the seminal report on the resource. Preliminary indications seem to show that the resource runs from the valley all the way past Corpus and San Antonio, up around Houston and to the east side of Dallas, which, as we know, is where all the load centers are predominantly in the state. So that would be great if we can make that happen.
So it seems, Barry, it'd be better to figure out where geothermal is not a good resource in Texas. That might be the easier thing to study.
Well, we are really cautiously optimistic. I think it's going to come down to price point and how far we are from being economic if we're going to play in the competitive electricity market. I was shocked yesterday. One of the speakers said that he thought the price could be as low as $21. I've seen ranges from $25 to $50 a megawatt hour, and we'll just have to see. It may be, and why don't you address this, that in the beginning, geothermal could play a role as a reliability product rather than a bulk power resource in the competitive market. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that would be great, in fact. So having that dispatchability of a reliability-based product to assist us in managing this grid flexibility that we're getting from both solar and wind would be the perfect spot for this resource to fit in. Now, I know that geothermal is once it's up and operating, it wants to operate like a baseload resource. There is some room for that, but most of what we need is in that dispatchability. And so I think there's opportunities in our ancillary services. There's opportunities in just flexibility to meet energy demand. There's great places that I think geothermal can fit in and really meet the need of all Texas.
Well, there are a couple of demonstration projects that are happening now. A company called Sage, for example, has a demonstration project at Arlington Field outside of Houston on a self-sustaining microgrid powered by geothermal. There's a project down in South Texas. There's some creative technologies, one of them called a closed loop technology, which would run piping down through the earth and bring it back up heated. I think we're going to see all of those in the not too distant future. And the other thing, which you and I've chatted about, is along with help from the Mitchell Foundation and my colleague, Matt Welch, we've stood up this TxGEA as an alliance to work on public education, awareness among stakeholders, and advocacy on on behalf of the geothermal industry. You know, one of the beauties of Texas, and I'll put my Railroad Commission hat on for a moment, is we punched over 1 million holes in the ground looking for oil and gas in the Lone Star State. And that has given us this incredible reservoir of data that tells us what the subsurface conditions look like. And as you've seen throughout Pivot the last couple of days, calling upon the skill and expertise of the oil and gas industry is critical in making geothermal economic and viable, especially when it comes to the downhole work. We're the best. You're from Texas, you know this. We're the best in the world at drilling, and so I think there is a lot that can be done as we look to the future.
Let me jump in on that as well,
Sure.
Barry. So what a phenomenal place to do geothermal. If anywhere in the world, if there's a place where it would be easiest to do geothermal, is in a location where you have the skilled workforce, you've got the technology, you've got the equipment you need, you got the pipe you need, all of it right here in the state of Texas. None of that do we have to develop. We don't have to bring it in from outside. We don't have to train a new workforce. Everyone is here. And so this becomes just a small piece of that capability of drilling oil wells throughout Texas, a small piece of that to implement what we would need to do for geothermal. I think puts us in a great posture. You know, Texas has so many advantages. I mean, real just structural advantages, but also advantages in the climate that we have for renewables in Texas. I think this is another great opportunity for renewables in Texas that we could use our existing skill set to drive this.
A couple of questions from the audience, Brad. We've got about 10 minutes left. One person writes that while she appreciates the CARE acronym, she's getting a little nervous sometimes when ERCOT calls for conservation, but at the same time, she's really concerned about the environment. And you know, you address that. Maybe you could just speak to it a little bit further.
Oh, so absolutely. So when I talk about these issues for the person that put the question in, I constantly want to make sure that every one of you understands we want to continue to drive wind and solar development in Texas. What we're trying to achieve, though, and that reliability part of that CARE acronym, is to make sure that when wind and solar is not there, we have the resources available to meet the rest of our need. And in fact, the way I've talked to every CEO of a renewable company, and they understand this, is that if we can solve the problem of dispatchability, making sure that we can cover all Texans when there's Dunkelflaute, then we don't stand in the way at all of more development of renewables. So in fact, we're trying to find a way that there's no resistance to renewables in Texas, that we can bring as much of that as possible into the state by making sure that we have dispatchable generation. And in fact, as we talked on this call so far, geothermal fits both categories, dispatchable and clean. And it'll be a great resource for us to help to meet that challenge.
Yeah, one of the things we heard from a previous panel was how geothermal resources could work as a battery almost in taking care to store some energy in the Earth's subsurface. And that would be an interesting application of it as well. You know, geothermal sort of position between solar and wind, which are renewables, and oil and gas. And, you know, it occupies, I think, a very important position. It's almost not renewable, and it's almost, we could call it inexhaustible once it gets to be cost competitive and the technology has been firmed up. Another question that came in is, we saw with wind and solar from the federal government some subsidies, and so far that has not presented itself for the geothermal industry. I know you're not in tax policy. That's not what you do at ERCOT. You're the grid operator. But as you think about ways that the government could prompt greater adoption of renewable, any of these ideas come to mind for geothermal?
Oh yeah, clearly there should be an opportunity there for geothermal. On a national scale, it probably, you know, it's going to be tough to get their attention to something like that. I believe that geothermal probably helps out California, Texas, a few of the Gulf Coast states. It probably doesn't help out New York, New England, or anything in that region. I would assume, Barry, you know better than I would, but I doubt there's many geothermal opportunities until you get down to, say, Pennsylvania. But getting national attention to it, I think, is important because so many regions are trying to achieve low carbon standards. California is searching out a zero carbon challenge. They've got quite a bit of geothermal in California already, but getting more federal government support for development would be very valuable to this industry at its very beginning. You mentioned some prices earlier, 25 to, I think you said 50 something dollars.
25 to 50, yeah.
50. So far this year, and remember, this has been a very hot year for Texas, but so far this year, the average price, that means every price, every dollar of every 15 minutes up until now, from January 1st, is $64. So the price of the market for a baseload facility this year would be sufficient to cover all the costs for new geothermal. And now that won't always be for the next 20 years. So we have to make sure that we're meeting the pro forma requirements of these types of facilities, but finding some way to get additional government support towards the nascent parts of geothermal for the beginning of this stage of development, I think would be extremely valuable.
Brad, one of the things you mentioned in our remaining time was ERCOT plans transmission. And we built a lot of transmission in our state, but we need to build more because oftentimes the resource, whether it's wind or solar or geothermal, may not be close to the load. Last session, or I think maybe last two sessions, the legislature has looked at making the building of transmission maybe a little bit easier and doing it for economic as well as reliability. How do you think about transmission at ERCOT?
Well, that's a loaded question. I love transmission. Maybe I love transmission too much. I used to tell a story that I was sitting on my back porch, I could look at the Colorado River winding through the hill country in Texas. And we were up on kind of a high hillside, so we could see it wind down for probably 15 miles down the way and see the river turn. And that was off on my left. On the right was a hydroelectric dam with all the transmission coming in down into it. When I sit on my porch, I always look to the right because I love the look of that transmission. Now, so transmission is a great equalizer in our system. It allows all generation to compete for all load. And we have to manage it to make sure we're not overspending. We're spending about $1 billion a year on new transmission in all of Texas. I mean, all of the transmission companies are doing that. And that's a great level of investment. That's where we should be in Texas. Staying up with our rather extraordinary load growth requires that type of investment. So the grid is sound. The grid is good from a transmission development side and a reinvestment side of things. And we now have capability through the legislature to look at economics as well and resiliency. Those are two things that we didn't have before. We planned for reliability, but resiliency requires that we step that up a bit. So where we need to step that up is along the Gulf Coast. About every 3 years, we get a major hurricane in Texas on the Gulf Coast, somewhere, usually between Corpus Christi and Houston. And in that range, we have to improve our transmission planning process to recognize that additional risk. And today we don't have that risk built into our planning process. So that's resiliency. The other piece is on economics. We haven't had the ability to study for economics for years, which really drive when there's congestion in our system, how do we relieve that congestion? So we're adding economics back in. The legislature has given us that authority again. It was taken away some years ago, but it's back now. And we expect to be able to start that once the PUC completes its rules later this year. And there's a number of products that could help renewables in various regions, especially in regions like Rio Grande Valley, and exporting some of the renewables out of that area.
Right. I used to tell a story that in one of my statewide campaigns, I was out in West Texas with one of my sons traveling, and we went underneath one of the CREZ transmission lines. And I pointed it out to him, and he said, "Well, that's just a transmission line." And I said, "Yeah, CREZ is no different than, it's not an alternative species of transmission. It's a transmission line. It's agnostic to what power it picks up on one end, and it delivers it to customers on the end." And for many years, that was the principal tool that the PUC had to try to move power into load pockets, areas like Houston, where it's very difficult to build a new power generation plant for a variety of reasons.
So Barry, the work that y'all did at that time, on CREZ is incredible. And it's recognized around the world as kind of the leadership model for how that should be done for building out to bring in more renewable generation. I know in New York, we looked at it several times. How could we do something similar? And that was really coming from the very top of government in New York. How can we do something like CREZ? So great work on the CREZ. We've outbuilt it though. We've built more wind generation in those regions than CREZ can currently accommodate. Not in the heat of the summer, right? But when the wind blows really in the spring and the fall, we have some congestion issues we have to deal with. So that's one of the areas where this tool can help us.
Well, Brad, let me say we really appreciate having you on with us today. And I know I'll speak for all Texans, we feel very comfortable with you in the driver's seat at ERCOT. We thank you for the job that you're doing out there. I once said that ERCOT's control room puts NASA to shame, the work that you guys do balancing the system. And I think you've seen from what we've discussed and the other panelists throughout the week, geothermal really appears to be on the cusp of being commercial and providing that needed dispatchable, reliable energy to the ERCOT grid. Small in the beginning, understandable, as wind was 20 years ago, perhaps. But eventually we hope where we can give you that 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 megawatts of dispatchable that is not dependent upon weather or light or temperature or all those things that you have to grapple with. Any final comments, Brad?
Oh, just to say, I look forward to that day, Barry. I hope this industry gets the boost it needs, and I'd love for Texas to be the first place that they come to invest.
Well, we are the energy capital of the world, and we need to remain it in all forms. So again, Brad, thanks so much. I know how busy it is. It's going to be another hot day today in Texas, but I feel very comfortable, and we thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Barry.
And with that, we'll say goodbye, and we look forward to the rest of the conference.